Okay, I think we are live now. Just checking to see how many people we have coming in. Okay, I see the participants coming in, around 47 or so. So hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Thanks for joining. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're from. We'll get started in just a minute or two. I'm going to open up the chat here, see where people are coming from. Great. So we got someone from Washington Heights, New York City. Chile, great. Thanks for letting us know. Mexico, Maldives. Oh, great. We're getting lots of names flowing into the chat. Too much for me to even read, really, but I can kind of see it's really, really international. So that's fantastic. Canada, UK, Wisconsin, Seattle, Seal Beach, California. Let's see here, Mexico City. Now I'm looking for places I know. Been to Mexico City, Brussels, Belgium. This is great. We're already up to about 110 people on here, so maybe we'll get started. 1 second. Once I learn how to close the chat here. Okay. So welcome to office hours for In the Studio Postwar Abstract Painting. This is meant to be an informal hour-long conversation to extend the discussion in the course, but also to answer some of your questions about materials and process. I'm Alex Roediger. I'm a MoMA employee. I'm an oil painter, and I'm also a previous student of In the Studio Postwar Abstract Painting. I do a lot of different types of things at MoMA, mostly working with data analytics, but also helping out the education department, digital media, and our finance department. With me today are three of our co-hosts. So maybe we can go around and introduce ourselves, starting with Michael, then Anny, and then lastly, our very special guest, Anne. Michael, you want to take it away? I think you're muted.
Hello. Hello, I'm Michael Duffy. I'm a painting conservator at MoMA, and I'm joining you from the conservation studio today. Welcome.
Anny?
Hi, I'm Anny Aviram. I'm a Paintings Conservator, and I'm joining you from home. And welcome, everybody.
And Anne?
Hi, I'm Ann Temkin. I'm the Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture, and I'm here in my office in MoMA, and very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, great. So throughout this session, please post your questions for us in the Q&A and make sure to select all participants and attendees as a recipient. You can upvote any questions in the Q&A that's you're most interested in us responding to, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the next hour. And we'll also be covering questions that were submitted in advance. Several of our MoMA colleagues are also present behind the scenes, so you may also see them responding in the chat. Also, feel free to use the chat to talk with other attendees. We are recording this session, and it will be shared in week 1 reading and resources with a summary of links in the coming days. So Michael and Anny are both conservators, and we talked before during our last In the Studio office hours. However, Anne, you're the Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA, which is a really fascinating job. Since this is your first In the Studio office hours, would you mind telling us a little bit about your role at the museum?
Yes, thanks. So Anny and Michael are the ones who actually take care of the paintings literally. I'm the one who takes care of them more figuratively. And really, I think the curator's job is divided into 3 categories. I think the best known category is making the loan exhibitions that occur every season at the museum. The other 2 aspects are far less known, but take just as much time, if not more. The second is the displays in our collection galleries, which occupy the majority, actually, of the areas in the museum. We have thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of works of art in our collection, and the curators are working at all times to figure out which ones we want to put on view in what kind of rooms. All of our rooms have themes. We're rotating those rooms every year. And so essentially making the galleries for the collection works as fluid and as idea-based as the loan shows is an ongoing, never-ending process. And then the third part of our job, so the three hats, exhibitions, collection galleries, and then acquisitions. We're always adding to the collection. Right now, for example, we in painting and sculpture are planning for our acquisition meeting that comes up in the fall. We have 4 acquisition meetings a year. We acquire about 10 things per meeting, and that includes historical things as well as art by, artists who aren't in the collection yet. And the amount of decision-making that we're doing, obviously the spending of money, the searching for gifts, asking for gifts, this is an important part of our job in ways that I can't even begin to describe. And just to say for a minute, if you think about it, the only reason that MoMA is because generations ago, the curators in painting and sculpture and all of the other departments were choosing which were the important paintings to have here at MoMA. Obviously, they made good choices, and that's our entire identity today. So my colleagues and I feel the burden, the responsibility, the privilege, the honor of making those decisions today about art from the past that isn't yet in the collection and should be, or art from the present moment that will end up being, long after we're dead, the important, significant, meaningful art to generations much later than our own, that will therefore make MoMA matter just as much for what it did about this era as for what it did about the 20th century. So I think that, in the end, our legacies as curators depend so much on those decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to ask you a few more questions while we have you before we start the Q&A part, if you don't mind. So we were talking yesterday. Well, let me first say that, Anne, you weren't involved in selecting the artworks for this course. However, you did organize an exhibition several years back that does have some parallels with the class that our learners are taking. And that exhibition was called Abstract Expressionist New York. Maybe just using that show as an example, could you share with us any insights as to how you select the work that was on view for that show? I think just in general, the kind of questions getting at, there's just so much art out there. How do you, what's some of the thinking that goes into selecting the very few works that do end up on the walls?
Yeah, and I mean, I would even refine your point to, it's not like there's so much art out there. There's so much art in here, in our own warehouse, right? So this was a show in 2010, what Alex is talking about, ABEX New York. And that came pretty much when I was pretty newly chief curator. And it occurred to me, or it hit me so hard, that the percentage of what we have on view is so slim compared to what we have in the vaults. And it's not like what we have in the warehouse is lesser art. I mean, yes, there are some clunkers, but for the most part, what we have in our warehouse is incredible art. And it really made me unhappy that from the abstract expressionist period, what our viewers generally saw was just a handful of artists and a handful of pictures by those artists. So we gave over a whole floor, the 4th floor, to a very healthy majority of all the paintings we had from that era. So in a way, we were the opposite of selective. And I think what was so revelatory about it is you felt almost the excitement of the 1950s in a way that you felt much more vividly, like being in there in the moment at that time, when you got to see many, many more artists than beyond the ones whose names became legendary. And I think that has informed our curating in the decade since, realizing that it's so much more rich to not just look at the few most famous names and the few most famous works by those famous names. And I think you'll see that in our galleries today, actually, even since we reopened last fall with new hangs, that the plurality of artists is incredible and much more exciting than the few.
Okay, great. And am I right in thinking that you also work with Anny and Michael in the conservation process, like both like maybe before and during treatments? Is that true as well?
Yeah, they're essential partners. And just on the same theme of familiar and less familiar works, they work to make sure that the most treasured works are, you know, in their best condition. And in fact, one of the great things about having been closed last year for a few months before we reopened the expansion were that Anny and Michael got to work on pieces that are normally on view 7 days a week that we would never take down because we would want to disappoint visitors who come from far away and expect to see that work on the wall. For example, Rousseau's Sleeping Gypsy, Michael did a lot of work on over the last year that he had been wanting to do for years and years. So they do that kind of thing. And then also, as you see behind Michael now, it can be lesser works that we've had in storage for decades that in previous generations we've said, oh, those aren't our most important works. And now we're saying, no, it's really interesting to look at these works by lesser known figures, maybe lesser known because they were women, for example, like the picture to Michael's right by Séraphine, a French self-taught artist. You know, and so those pictures need the kind of work maybe of being cleaned after spending half a century in our warehouse and now being ready to take center stage.
Okay, great. And let me, you know, before we get to individual questions, let me just bring up the fact that we've had many learners ask to learn more about prominent abstract expressionist artists of color, women, and queer artists in this period. And just in preparation for this, we thought we'd make a real quick slideshow that maybe you could speak to. So Steve, I believe you have a slideshow you could queue up for us.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the things about art history, all art history and definitely modern art history, is that for the most part, it was written by men over the last 100 years. And the curators were primarily men over the last 100 years as well. And I think the way that abstract expressionism entered the history books was absolutely with an emphasis, is a polite way of putting it, on the artists who matched in demographic profile the people who were writing about them or who were buying them and putting them on the walls of the museum. So when we reopened last year, the curators made a very big effort to diverge from that history and to actually show a lot of art that, interestingly, we had bought at the time or in the years since, but was never deemed the most important, and so was in the warehouse rather than on the gallery walls. So I'm just going to show you some galleries that are on view right now, of course, in closed galleries, but hopefully galleries that will be open to the public again within a few weeks. Here's one of our abstract expressionist galleries with a picture by Norman Lewis, an African-American, next to a Gorky. Norman Lewis is someone who's become widely recognized over the last just decade or so, but at the time he was a fully involved member of this group, painter of great reputation. Again, didn't somehow, mainly because of issues of distinction between white painters and black painters, make it into the history books in the way that he now is there firmly. Next. Here you have a close-up of the Norman Lewis. Next. Here's another shot of a gallery up right now with a Hedda Stern on the left and a Lee Krasner on the right. In many cases with women artists from that time, they were married to a male artist. In Hedda Stern's case, it was the person we know mostly through his cartooning, actually, Saul Steinberg. And on the right, Lee Krasner married to Jackson Pollock. And in both of those cases, incredible painters. These are both paintings we've had for years and years, looking splendid. Close-ups to come. Next. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about the head of stern, Anny? You have to unmute.
Sure. I'm very taken about this painting because it's actually a view of New York. And she used to be, like you said, and did drawings, cartoons, but when she came to New York, she saw what was going on with the abstract expressionists. So she sort of let loose and painted this fantastic painting that we acquired. And it's been shown now in a woman's abstract expressionist exhibition that you just showed. And also it's now on view again. So yes, it's a woman and
I'm correct, aren't I, that this was partly painted with spray?
Yes,
spray?
She used spray, exactly, and very good. She used spray paint, and also she used metallic paint, and also brushed it while it was a little bit wet. So it was a very unusual technique to create all her transparencies.
Mm-hmm.
So happy to see her getting her due from lots of people who've loved this picture up all year. Next one. And the Krasner, Michael, tell us about this because it's this is one of the paintings that doesn't really come across in a slide, I have to say.
Yeah, it's hard to tell from the image, but the texture is really, the texture of the paint is really heavily applied in impasto. So in contrast to the head of stern, you have this almost three-dimensional effect that she achieved by applying paint directly from the tube. So in contrast to Pollock or other artists who were flinging paint around, she was very carefully building it up in these sections to make this incredibly beautiful textured surface.
Yeah, yeah. Next slide. So here you see a very large Lee Krasner at the back called Gaia, installed beside a sculpture by Noguchi, and to its right, a very beautiful painting by Grace Hartigan. So again, Krasner and Hartigan taking primary real estate, as we like to call it, in our gallery together with the artists who they were so long overshadowed by. And let's look at close-ups of those works. One remark I can make about the Krasner, you can see that the date of this painting, 1966, Gaia, is made almost a decade after Pollock's death, and obviously belatedly, you could say, in terms of the invention of abstract expressionist techniques. And for a long time, I think women were left out of the story because oftentimes they weren't there in that founding moment because they weren't allowed into the bar, or they were home taking care of a kid or busy taking care of the husband at his easel. And in so many cases, women artists of this generation are what you might call late bloomers. And it's really important not to just stick to that kind of idea that somebody's work in his 20s or her 30s is more important than the work that might come in middle or even late age. And next. And the Grace Hartigan, as you can see, this is a work which in scale and power has so much to do with the work of people like Franz Klein or de Kooning. But Grace Hartigan felt so unwelcomed by the New York art world at some levels that she ended up returning home to Baltimore. So another thing that women artists maybe didn't play along with was staying in the hub where the friendships, connections would happen. And so for that reason, got a little bit left out of the history that now we're really working hard to reincorporate the mats, because at the time, Grace Hartigan, you know, was very much a central figure, again, both to her female and her male colleagues. And next. Here you see a Beaufort Delaney on the left with a Helen Frankenthaler on the right. Talking about Grace Hartigan going to Baltimore, well, Beaufort Delaney left New York for Paris, which was considered a much more friendly environment actually for African-American artists and writers in the 50s. I think we have a close-up of that painting. Michael, you've worked on this painting quite a bit. Tell us about what's unusual with this one.
Well, it's interesting, Anne, because Delaney obviously returned to the painting and adjusted the colors significantly. I think you can see there's glimpses of blue and red underneath, and he returned to it after those colors had been applied with his veil of yellow paint. So he's really returning to the composition and selectively brightening it and using this yellow tonality, which he used quite often during this time.
And you had told me something about the signature here.
That's right. You can see in the lower right corner, well, when you come and see the painting in person, have a look in the lower right corner, you can see he actually signed it twice.
From two different episodes in a way of working.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
Okay, is that the end of the slideshow? I think so. Okay, great. So let's go on to some more questions. First question from Andre. I read that Rothko used commercial house paint and the colors faded sometimes. Will we have the same problems nowadays if we use commercial house paints? And do Rothko's you have at MoMA look the same as they did when they were first painted?
We'll give that to Michael and Anny.
I think as far as we know, they look pretty close to what they were, but possibly they faded a little bit, but not substantially because all the precautions we take at MoMA, not to expose our paintings to too much light and have a stable environment. But if you didn't have what we have at MoMA, probably would have been more noticeable, any fading.
Okay. Maria asks, George O'Keeffe and Agnes Martin lived within 60 miles of each other in the 1970s in New Mexico. Both had ties to Taos. Did they ever cross paths?
That's a question I don't want to answer because I'm not positive. But now I want to find out immediately.
I know, it's a really interesting question, yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry we've struck out on that one, but we'll look it up and maybe we can later add it into the chat, or maybe we can follow up a little bit later in the course. Martinez, I've read in 2008 book by James Elkins and Ad Reinhardt. Pardon me, let me start over. I read it in a 2008 book by James Elkins that Ad Reinhardt's black paintings, like the ones at MoMA, are often hard to appreciate in real life because they are either covered in dust or protected by reflective panel of glass, which hampers proper viewing. Has the problem that Elkins refers to has been fixed, and if so, how?
Oh, this is one of the heartbreak questions, right? Because I know exactly what the writer is talking about. The surfaces of Reinhardt paintings are so very delicate and vulnerable to fingerprints that then can't really be removed, that we do put them under glass. But it breaks my heart because indeed, I agree, they're not the same. Anny or Michael, would you have something to add to that?
No.
No? Okay.
Okay. No, I just want to say that, yes, we appreciate that. It's true, you lose a lot. But occasionally we take the glazing for a little bit, but not too often, because they've been really damaged. And as Anne says, it's almost impossible to repair those marks.
Right. Asli asks, how does MoMA plan to approach its acquisition and programming in light of the current situation in the US, in particular, and the changes that the world faces in general? Is there room for geographies currently not represented in MoMA's collection to be discovered? Do you organize research trips?
Repeat the very last part of the question.
Sure, and they were asking, do we organize research trips to help us, better understand geographies that currently aren't represented, as well as maybe the questioner would like at the museum?
Yes, it's true. We have a program that's with the acronym of CMAP, Contemporary Modern Art Perspectives, which for over a decade has funded curatorial travel to other continents so that we learn a lot more than we might have been taught in art history about art beyond Europe and North America over the next year or two, or who knows. That obviously is going to be replaced by the old reversion to book learning, or perhaps new things like Zoom chats with scholars in those other countries. But yes, travel had become very, very important to our process over this last decade or so. And that is on hiatus for the foreseeable near future. So we luckily have quite a lot of backlog of research and ideas from the trips that have been happening that are going to be enough to carry us through a lot of new initiatives in both acquisitions and exhibitions over these next few years. And then we'll get back to the actual physical travel as soon as we can.
Great, okay. Kenny asks, do you have any advice for new artists who want to start their own exhibition? I'm kind of reading this question one of two ways, potentially their own work, or if they wanted to curate. I'm going to guess that maybe they're talking about their own work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's so important for an artist, well, not all artists, but many, not only to make their work, but to show it. And my advice on that is don't be hung up on conventional thoughts of galleries in Chelsea or this kind of art center or museum. Always just make sure to invite people to your studio, invent kind of pop-up type gallery situations, viewing hours, even in your apartment and so forth. I just think showing art, obviously I decided to be a curator, right? Showing art is the other half of the equation of making art, and really an artwork isn't doing its full job, or it's not fulfilling its role in the world, to me, unless it's communicating to people, you know, at the same time as it's just being a work of art as an object. So yes, I encourage all ways of inviting people to see your art and getting your art to people. And I even, obviously online today has become an incredible resource for doing that, but there's also no substitute, as we feel strongly in the museum, for being face-to-face with an object.
I spend most of my time busy working at MoMA, but in my spare time, I am a practicing artist. And I have found, just to reiterate what you're saying, I'll have studio events that'll be very well attended. And honestly, I get so many eyeballs looking at my work online. It's just a really great source for people to see it and appreciate it, to get sales as well. I think there's really no end of like unconventional ways to show your your art just online, or also in real life too. But online, of course, is more important than ever, certainly in the last few months.
Yeah.
So Linda was asking, what percentage of work is on exhibit versus storage? So I know for most museums, it's a small percentage. Would any of you like to wager a guess as to what it might be for MoMA?
It's a single-digit percentage, there's no question. And it varies by department. So in painting and sculpture, our total number of objects in our holdings is 4,000. So it's actually, I would say above 10% that are on view easily. But there are departments, say like photography or drawings and prints, where these works are collected by the tens of thousands. And so our holdings are hundreds of thousands. And in those cases, obviously, they weren't mainly acquired to be on the walls. They were mainly acquired to be consulted, to be shown periodically, but to be there almost more like in the sense of a library. So when you think of those departments, it's not even 1% that's on view at a given time. But that's because that wasn't the intention when we acquired them. It's almost more like thinking about books in a library.
And I would also add, just following the digital theme here, that we do have many tens of thousands of works on view online. And
Yes.
I also look very carefully at our website analytics. And if you're of the opinion as I am that online visitation should be counted just like in-person visitation, you realize that 90% of our visitors are actually online, with a much smaller percent actually visiting the museum. So fortunately, there is like a really great access to our collection to the public online as well too. And we're always trying to think of ways to like make that more interactive and more fulfilling. You know, this class, I think, you know, being one of those ways. So the next question comes from Michael. Can anyone speak to the large scale size of the work from the New York school? Size is not a typical material characteristic. However, since many of these works would not even fit into people's homes because of the scale, and in fact, look more like murals, can anyone speak to the size or scale? Off the top of my head, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I vaguely recall hearing that maybe Jackson Pollock had a work that was too big for one of his rooms, and maybe he had to alter the room to actually fit the size of the painting. Is that story true?
What his works, both at his gallery, the Betty Parsons Gallery, and at one very notable advocate of his work, one of his great collectors, a man named Ben Heller. In Ben Heller's living room, they unstretched one of his paintings and it sort of overlapped from the wall onto the ceiling. And in the Betty Parsons Gallery, the paintings would essentially fit floor to ceiling again, you know, without frames, without any kind of normal easel painting kind of setting. And it was just about getting the canvas, you know, somehow on the wall, so that it essentially, for some viewers, of course, who didn't understand it all, became the equivalent of wallpaper. But yeah, I think that one answer, there are many answers to the question. One is that this was after World War II. Europe had been devastated in so many ways during this period. The arts had been quite crushed in much of Europe during the war and prior to the war. And New York and the USA in general kind of had its moment to become the international center for new painting and sculpture and all kinds of art forms, performing arts, movies, etc. And so I think the big size of those paintings, in many ways, intentionally or not, literally echoes the sense of now we are a big deal. Now New York City is big, instead of being the provinces in relationship to somewhere like Paris. So that bigness was made extremely explicit by the canvas sizes. But then there's also many other answers. For example, people like Pollock were influenced by the Mexican muralists. So literally that word mural was a concept that was very fresh in their minds. Michael, Anny, you probably have more things to say about big canvases as a new desideratum, because for sure it's new at that point, except in the sense of murals, not only from the Mexicans, for example, but from WPA projects like for post offices and other federal buildings, where mural scale in realistic paintings, of course, not abstract paintings, was very common.
Yeah, the only thing I can add that the size of some of our canvases, like Site Twombly or all that, they wouldn't fit in our building coming from a door. They have to be rolled, and then we have to stretch them right in situ. So it doesn't happen too often. We don't have that many, but quite a few that we have to do that. They wouldn't fit.
Yeah.
And in terms of the size, I think the artists were embracing commercially available household paints, things like that, that lent themselves to be flung and spattered and used on a larger scale, like you would paint a wall. So there was no restraint because, you know, you just had one little tube of oil paint. You could really cover some territory as an artist.
Absolutely.
Not be restrained.
Okay. Amelia wrote, I love the soak stain technique of Morris Louis and Helen Frankenthaler. I know Louis used Magna, and Frankenthaler had later switched to an acrylic as turpentine created issues on unprimed canvas. What is the best way I can replicate their process to try on my own? Should I use oil or acrylic?
Oh.
I think Magna might be an acrylic resin. Are you guys familiar with that at all? Is that true? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
That's a brand name, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was formulated by a man named Louis Beaucourt together with Lewis to get these kind of effects he wanted, to make veils of paint, as the learner describes. And Helen Frankenthaler early on used oil, but then realized that acrylic could also achieve the same effects. I think it's probably safer to go with the acrylic, just in terms of you know, not exposing yourself to turpentine on such a large scale. But you know, always you can experiment with the materials you have and achieve some interesting effects.
Elizabeth writes, are paintings of some of the Abex artists difficult to conserve? If they were using low quality house paint and adding lots of turpentine and or linseed oil and painting with oil paint and or linseed oil and painting with oily paint over leaner paint, wouldn't there be problems in the long run? So the, you know, the whole idea is that you would paint lower layers more with turpentine, which is a quicker drying agent, and then the upper layers maybe have linseed oil, which kind of slows the process down. Some of these artists were maybe reversing it. They weren't using the traditional techniques. So yeah, so are there any examples or any thoughts you have about difficult Abex works to conserve?
I just want to say that the house paints actually are quite robust paints, and they, like Jackson Pollock, and they withstand very well. So if he's afraid of using commercial paints, they are very robust and he can use them. So the layering is another issue, as you described.
Yeah, and conserving the paintings can be challenging because of the amount of paint on the canvas. If the artist was just squeezing the paint directly from the tube, sometimes it didn't adhere so perfectly. So we've, in our Jackson Pollock conservation project several years ago, we actually conserved by reconstructing little tiny bits of impasto that could be added on where it was missing. And of course, that's something that we can reverse, but to help visually integrate parts of the painting, we ended up doing that kind of reconstruction on a small scale.
Okay, great. So Connie asked a practical question. Should oil paintings be varnished? I noticed that many artists nowadays sell their paintings soon after they were painted. Do they not varnish?
Well, it's an aesthetic decision, varnishing. So should they be varnished? Depends on what you want. You want the paintings to look shiny or more intense, maybe you would. But some artists choose not to varnish their paints, like Matisse or others. So it's really an aesthetic decision whether to varnish or not. As a protective coating, we've learned that really doesn't protect the surface as much as you think. As long as you keep the paintings in good environment and clean and climate control, they will sustain the.
That's really interesting. I often thought of varnish as a way to protect paintings, but you're saying it doesn't add a huge layer of protection?
What it does, it really changes the whole aesthetics of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
If you varnish a Matisse, for example, it looks very different than what you intended.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing a lot with our paintings, because at one point we used to varnish our paintings, we're reverting those techniques by removing the varnishes and trying to return the painting what we consider is the intent of the artist. And all these discussions, again, we discuss this with Anne when we're doing sort of varnish removals that are oxidized and all that. We consult with Anne because she would, it's just great to have a additional eye, a learned eye that could tell us, yeah, this is wrong, this is right. So yes, that's what a lot of the treatments we're doing now.
And when you think of the abstract expressionist period in particular, varnish would be the opposite of what the artists would have wanted, because their whole mentality was spontaneity and freedom and kind of gut painting, right? And then to almost literally seal that would have been so against their intentions, but in fact it did happen. sometimes. So yeah, I think one of the fascinating parts about the conservation role for people like Anny and Michael is realizing how certain viewpoints of their own predecessors have changed so much. And indeed, a lot of their work ends up being undoing or revising what the person who had their job 50 years ago actually did. And it's not so different from the way a curator's job is rethinking the kind of writing, the kind of point of view that, in my case, my predecessors might have had 50 years ago, and realizing, no, this, you know, we have new and different thinking right now.
So the next question comes from Aniak. I'm quite interested in finding out what it's like to work with these powerful paintings. For example, a Rothko. As a conservator, does the power of the painting impact you? Do you step into that painting as it were? I love that question. Or are you guys just too worried about how to conserve it, like, so you don't hurt it?
Well, we have the luxury of being able to look into the layers of the paintings through different imaging techniques that we have available to us. And that's really a privilege to really look closely at a painting by Rothko, because you see how really complex they are and how really majestic the color combinations can be. And seeing it even on a microscopic scale is very impressive.
I always think in terms of Anny and Michael vis-a-vis surgeons, right? And if you're operating on a body, you can't start thinking about the person and thinking about their family or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to really, really focus, or you would just be totally overwhelmed by the fact that your fingers were undoing the paint that Mark Rothko or whomever had painted. I mean, yeah. But it takes a lot of emotional detachment, I think.
Very true, Anne.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like to try to take advantage of lunch breaks to actually appreciate the art, because I get so not really used to it, but I'm just kind of in the weeds of my work. So it can surprise you, like, oh my gosh, I work at one of the most incredible places, you know, just to see that stuff. So, well, I'm glad you guys aren't distracted by the beauty of the work while you're, you know, focusing on preserving it. So Barbara asks, this is a little bit of a different question. Barbara asks, are you able to tell us what visiting MoMA will be like during the pandemic? So that's a great question. I have actually not been to MoMA yet. I think maybe a couple of you are there right now.
Yeah.
Your experience is maybe a little different than what the visitors will be. We're going to open up in some time, you know, in the next few weeks, months. There's no date has been put on it, but I do know that we're working with health experts to really make sure that we have just a really safe and excellent and peaceful, very positive visit for any of our visitors. Would you guys who have already are slowly coming back to work, do you guys have any thoughts on the topic?
I think actually it'll be pretty much the same for our visitors as for our staff, in that masks all the time, everywhere. Being very conscious of spacing oneself out from other visitors, not big clusters of people in front of, you know, one little drawing or something like that. But we're lucky, you know, we feel very fortunate vis-a-vis, say, an institution that was devoted to opera or ballet or theater, because we're an arts institution that can offer visitation that isn't putting people cheek by jowl right next to one another. And people are kind of free to walk around to lesser crowded places when a certain place becomes more crowded seeming to them. You know, there's still such a difference between what it will be like coming to a museum in terms of ability to come back very soon, as opposed to, say, a theater. So, you know, on the spectrum, we're feeling like we're fortunate among cultural institutions. And if all goes well, definitely, you know, it will be during the course of the summer that we'll see visitors again. Obviously, we'll restrict numbers very strictly, so it won't be up to you to escape the crowds. Once you're in the building, you'll know that there are only as many people as was deemed safe for us to contain, which is a fraction of our usual capacity, but we can't wait.
Elias asked, why is Agnes Martin sometimes considered abex and sometimes minimalist? Which would you say?
Of course, I'll take Agnes's side and say neither. Most artists don't like the labels that art critics or historians gave them, usually after the fact. And you know, what's much more important to them is their own individuality, and she would be an extreme example of that, rightly so.
Grain asks, can you advise how a canvas can be protected if you apply paint directly onto the canvas without priming, as Bacon and some abstract expressionists did?
Well, they did size their canvases if they didn't prime them, but they were sized. So they were somehow protected.
And what do you mean exactly by sizing?
Well, using rapid skin glue, for example,
Mm-hmm.
to size the canvas so it's not as absorbent.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ellen Frankenthaler, you know, you can see her canvases, or some of Pollock's, like, you know, he used unprimed canvas. But they are sized, so the size does help with absorption into the canvas, so it doesn't get stains when you're applying the paint. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think so, yeah. And I've never used rapid skin glue, but is that transparent at all? Can you like look right through and see the texture of the canvas?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it may look like raw paint against the canvas, but in fact there is a thin layer of rapid skin glue there. Yeah.
Or other size, could be something else, but you know, yes.
So a related question from Margaret: what process do you use to conserve Helen Frankenthaler's paintings as she paints directly onto raw canvas?
They're tricky. Depends what the damage is or what we need to do.
Yeah.
But they are very tricky to conserve.
And is it fair
because
to say
because they're painted directly on the fabric, almost like it's stained, we sometimes use techniques that textile and paper conservators use, like just gentle applications of moisture and things if they're stained. So there's techniques that we use that are different than, say, a traditional oil painting. So they do present challenges.
Yeah, gotcha.
It's very, I'll just jump in there for a second. You know, it's interesting to remember that so many of these artists who are doing radical, really innovative work, sort of the last thing on their mind is my painting going to last hundreds of years in a museum? Because what they're doing, they may not even dare to be thinking in terms of their art being something people would want to look at for 1,000 years.
I think that's one of the fun things about this class is it really kind of shakes up a lot of the traditional painting techniques and invites you to just go a little wild, you know, try things that you never do. What happens if you mix oil with water? You know, you can make really beautiful work that can be appreciated for quite some time. It may not be around for 500 years, but that might be okay too. People can, you know, really appreciate the art, you know, in a shorter lifespan.
As you know, the Kuni used to do that. So
yeah, that was part of this class. So
you also have to keep conservators employed.
Yes. So we got 10 more minutes, so I'll try to squeeze in as many more questions as I can here. Dawn asks, as a beginner, my first attempt is a painting in the style of Rothko. I found it hard to soften the edges using water in my finger. An acrylic thinned with water was quite streaky. Is there an alternative you would suggest to create a veil of paint needed to soften the edges? I looked at some acrylic thinners and flow enhancers online. So I'll jump in with a few suggestions. You may want to experiment with some mediums. There's so many different acrylic mediums out there that are really fun to try and use. So that could certainly be an avenue. Do you guys have any thoughts on that one?
that sounds right.
Sometimes different types of brushes are available to help blend passages of paint. So there's even brushes specific for blending, for pastels and other kinds of mediums. So it might be worth looking for brushes that can help you do that.
And, you know, looking through the forum, I've seen some questions just in general about paint application, and I would recommend having a new and quality paintbrush, experimenting with adding thinners or thickeners, and really just experimenting with the pressure you're using to apply the brush, because I think there's a lot of questions about streakiness or too many strokes, and I think those kind of three issues come up a lot. So you can kind of use those three techniques to try to help get the surface you're looking for. Donna asks, which contemporary painters explore process as a primary focus in a similar way to the post-war abstract artists? Oh boy, I think there's probably a lot. Do you guys have any suggestions? Any artists you'd like to highlight?
I might not answer with names, but more in general saying that I think the spirit of a lot of contemporary painters, like it would have been in the 1940s and 50s, is actually to go against the rules, right? And in the 21st century, there are still rules that so many artists, the majority of artists, follow. And there are so many artists at the same time who are making really, really great strides in saying, I'm just questioning those rules. So I'm doing things that you've all been talking about, actually, about doing things with paint that paint isn't supposed to make happen, or putting things on a painting other than paint, or making a painting on something that isn't necessarily canvas. So kind of like, you know, when you think about it, painting for thousands, well, 1,000+ years has been very consistently paint on a canvas. So if you think about other art forms, the tools have changed, the mediums have changed, the format has changed. Painting on canvas, in some ways, if you're making a painting today, you're doing the same thing that Giotto did, or Raphael or Michelangelo did, etc. And I think for a lot of artists, one of their ways to liberate themselves from that is to say, let me question canvas, let me question paintbrush, let me question paint. Like all of those things could become different. And then you're off in who knows what kind of crazy directions.
Tomoko asks, if I use acrylic over oil paints, will oil paints slide off in time? I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but I think maybe we could, maybe others do. We could certainly speak to the idea of painting acrylic over oil. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, the conservators, I think, would be perfect to answer this one.
I think you would have to be prepared to see some cracking or some other kinds of interactions that you might not like. But who knows, you could be also achieving effects that are optically not possible using only one or the other. And certainly artists have experimented with mixing these materials together in ways that have held up. So I would say you'd want to see, do a test and see what kinds of effects you're getting, but be aware that some cracking or separation of the paint may occur with time.
So we have a question from Joan Camilo Bolanos to all of our panelists. I guess they're asking, ABEX is only from New York. What happened at the same time to other cities in the United States? Or we could add to the whole world.
Michael has one answer to that question in the painting behind his left shoulder, which is by an Italian artist named Armando Bocci from this period. And I think, again, it has to do with mythology. And the mythology of abstract expressionism was this New York phenomenon. Of course, there were artists painting in the same way around the same time all over the United States and elsewhere in the world. but the writers and the dealers were concentrated in New York, and they're the ones who perpetuated what, in fact, you know, is a false myth of it being a purely New York phenomenon. And right now, one of the really interesting parts of being a curator or an art historian is looking at those other artists from around the country and the world who are absolutely part of that same story. So just like we're looking again at overlooked artists because maybe of their gender or their ethnicity, even of their geography, they got left out of the story, and we're making that story a fuller one right now. Do you want to talk about the bocce a little bit, Michael, what you have in mind for it? This is going to go to an exhibition in Venice shortly.
Well, it's interesting because the artists use tempera paint to make the painting. So you have this really beautiful layering of materials bleeding into each other to get this very rich textured effect. So I was surprised to see that it was tempera, because I assumed just by looking at it in reproduction that it was an oil painting. But that's the beauty of getting to see things in person and study them, is to really learn more about techniques and become familiar with the artist's methods.
Val asks, could you describe the enamel paint that Pollock used? I guess commercial paints differ from one country to another, and I am unsure what local UK equivalent to try. Also, how did he avoid cracking and flaking a paint when stretching the already painted canvases when he painted them on the ground?
Well, the paint did crack when you mounted it on the stretchers. After it was a little bit dry, and then you stretch them, they did crack. But not always the paint fell, it just were cracks on the edges. So we see a lot on ours, that kind of cracks.
And I have a little bit of a follow-up question too. Has enamel paint, do you guys know if it's changed over the years? Like, I think of it as a purely oil-based hard surface. And now I think I see acrylic-based enamel. I'm wondering if maybe, you know, what the learner is referencing to potentially.
Oh, certainly the paint formulations have evolved significantly since when Pollock was using them, or the other Abex artists. So there was alkyd paints were used, which is a modified oil. And then enamels have also evolved using different kinds of polymers that are purely synthetic to get, you know, a high resistance, because typically they're used on sometimes outdoor surfaces or you know, in situations that are weather related. So they've been formulated, I think, to hold up in those situations, not necessarily to be applied as artist materials. And the formulations, I'm sure, vary from country to country because of regulations and so forth. So it's hard for me to comment on what might be the equivalent in the UK or Europe or Australia or anywhere else in the world. So I think, again, you have to work with what you have and experiment a little.
Okay, great. We have 1 minute, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. I hope we don't get cut off, but here we go. Diane asked, I was surprised to learn of the spiritual walk quest of some of these painters. Do you have any comments regarding this and the evidence of their faith coming through from their paintings?
That's a good question to answer for Anna.
That's a tough one.
Well, if you think about that, this movement took place just after the atom bomb, just after the Holocaust, just after the Depression. All these artists were dealing with an immediate past of death and destruction of a horrific kind of unfathomable scale. So it's not a surprise, I think, that a lot of them look to art as a kind of parallel route to some sort of renewed faith or world that they couldn't get from the kind of, you know, regular, normal daily life. So I think you can't separate the development of the artistic philosophies of this generation from the historic MoMA at which they came of age.
All right, great. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank you all so much for spending the hour with us. And I really appreciate all your really exciting and thoughtful questions. You're going to receive a short survey after this to help us to help inform future office hours and other virtual course offerings. In the meantime, we love to keep the conversation going, so please continue sharing with us by posting in the discussion forums. So thanks so much, and thanks so much for our special guest, Anne. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. This was so good. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.